welcome to everyone for joining this educational lecture this afternoon, the next in our series, and it's going to be led by Keith, talking about all ability transport. Keith serves on the board of Transport Focus with Competitions and Market Authority and the Financial Services Consumer Panel, a director and lead consultant for Railco. He is a qualified barrister, Cambridge University judge, business school facilitator and director of a specialist publisher, Non-ETH. So Keith, you come with glowing references, and we look forward with anticipation to hearing what you have to say to us this afternoon. So without further ado, Keith.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thanks everybody for the invitation to come. And when you hear somebody introducing you like that, it just sounds like somebody else. It's not me. But anyway, I have what's called a portfolio career, which spread across transport, but also competition markets and some legal work as well. And I mean, what I think it's really great to be here is just to have the opportunity to explain the work that I do around accessibility and transport and why it's important. I mean, I've got some notes here which are up on my other screen, so excuse me if I kind of seem like I'm staring off into space. It's just to remind myself that I've covered everything here. But I just wanted to briefly say the Disabled Persons Transport Advisory Committee, or DIPTAC for short, not a particularly sexy title, but I chair DIPTAC, and that is a public body that sits within the Department for Transport. And our role is very much to advise the Secretary of State, ministers, and senior policy officials on disabled people's access to transport and the built environment that connects transport, because obviously that's important too. It's no point being able to get on a train or a bus, but you can't get between the bus stop and the bus station and the train station. And I'll pick up on that as I go through the talk that I want to give. And I know you've had excellent talks from colleagues who I know, Steve Gooding from the RSE Foundation, for example, on autonomous and connected vehicles. And I think you heard from Sir Peter Hendy, Network Rail recently. I mean, all people that I work with, and I'm not going to go into detail about autonomous vehicles as such, but they are the future of mobility. And I thought it would be important towards the end of this just to mention why accessibility is important there and how that can be delivered. So just a very brief journey, look at the journey that we've been on with transport and accessibility. I just want to make sure everyone can hear me clearly before I set off on my talk. Great, thank you very much. Why is being accessible important? Well, of course, first, because the law requires it, and as a lawyer I would say that, wouldn't I? But secondly, and most importantly, because there are an awful lot of people in our society who benefit from improved accessibility, and that's a large and growing number, primarily due to the fact that we have an aging population, and I'll come back to that. And the development of accessibility innovation products and services is the greatest opportunity presented by the aging trend of a global population. And the transport sector plays such a key role in enabling people to meet their own needs, to travel, to work, to socialize, to play, or simply, take kids to school, to enhance our well-being as humans. And transport gives us access to employment, education, healthcare, and a social life, all really crucial things to the lives that we've come to live. There are currently around 14 million disabled people in the UK. So that's about 20% of the total population. And if you think about why that's important from a business case perspective, the government statistics show that within households that include a disabled person, the annual disposable income is £250 billion in those households. So any business, whether it's transport or otherwise, that intentionally or inadvertently excludes disabled people by failing to make their products and services accessible, loses out on so many levels, including the business opportunities. And as I've said, we have an aging population. Between 2010 and 2030, the number of people in the UK aged over 65 will have increased by 50%. And that's not just a UK issue. And there's a direct link between disability and and age. And as my mother, who's 87, keeps reminding me that as we get older, dear, we all start to fall apart. And I hope that's probably quite a stark message, but it's certainly the case that we become less mobile, we become less dexterous, we suffer hearing loss, sight loss, mobility loss. All of those things come with age, and most disabilities, being age related, mean that we are heading towards a society where accessibility becomes even more important. What does that mean? Well, I think one of the biggest challenges of the 21st century is not a surprise, and it's a bit of a ticking time bomb that has been ticking away for many decades. But it's very difficult to stereotype disabled people. I mean, the needs or older people, the needs and experiences of older people are not all the same, of course. Many older people are fully active. I think 22% of people over the age of 65 are in full or part-time employment. So they still need to commute to work by bus, by car, by train. And many people provide childcare for other family members as we get older, helping with the school run. Large proportion of journeys are taken to visit friends and relatives, or for daily necessities like shopping and visits to the GP, etc. I think it's really important, the work that we do, and for the transport sector and wider, is not to see people as having a disability. Often we talk about people as having a disability. It's society that creates the disability. So people are disabled by society, i.e. the physical environments that we build, the structures we design, the information we make available, the way we deliver services, and the people involved in all of those things. They are the ones who disable other people who need assistance, who need a different design, a different structure, a different environment. And of course, physical disabilities are not the only thing. They're the most obvious in terms of being able to see disability, but that is by far the minority. Most are non-visible, such as mental health conditions, autism, dementia, learning difficulties, anxiety even. And as a backdrop to this, just by way of context, the National Travel Survey, which is the Department of Transport survey annually, shows disabled adults make around 28% fewer trips per year than non-disabled people. And in terms of miles traveled per year, that's even greater, with disabled people traveling 40% less miles than non-disabled adults. Now let's look at the bright side. Let's look ahead. I mean, the transport sector is constantly in a state of innovation and development, and much of it focused on new technology, design, clean energy, electric vehicles, whether it's scooters, which is a particular bugbear of mine, or vehicles, cars, and even vertical takeoff taxis. All are here or very not far away around the corner. So part of what I wanted to talk about is why innovation is key to accessibility, and why accessibility is key to successful innovation. There's a note of caution. I mean, innovation is brilliant, exciting, can too often be completely inaccessible to many people if it's not properly thought through, and if it's not properly designed and properly delivered. So, as you'll have gathered, although I'm here to talk about transport, you won't be surprised to hear that my focus is really on people. And my aim is to ensure that technology and innovation, whatever guise it takes, whatever it looks and feels like, is designed and built on users' requirements. That's the huge potential of technology innovation that the UK is so brilliant at. Doesn't serve to exclude, but instead includes everybody. So most of the innovation we've seen over the years to improve transport is around physical access to vehicles. And they were often just simply the application of engineering design principles to solving relatively simple practical problems. The Harrington hump, many of you travel on the train or the tube, if you're in London, will see short areas of raised platform, higher than the rest of the platform. That's generally called Harrington humps after the inventor, and they're used to raise a section of platforms to provide level access to the train. So you don't have to have a whole platform, but you can have the relevant bit, and as long as people know where the accessible bit is. Low floor and kneeling are something that we've got used to in London and around the whole country. I mean, their innovation was brought in to allow the removal of steps onto the bus and the creation of enough flat space inside the bus for an area to be set aside for wheelchairs. In reality, it was an engineering development about front-wheel drive vehicles and easier maintenance. It was only afterwards that it was noticed that this would benefit disabled people. But still, it's a design innovation that has created more access to buses. And of course, technical regulations requiring accessibility on buses, coaches, trains is, as I say, mostly physical: color contrasting, grab handles, wide doorways, ramps, audio visual announcements, call points, designated wheelchair spaces. These are all very physical things. The trouble is, as Albert Einstein has said, if you always do what you always did, you'll always get what you always got. So the need is to deliver things that actually change society, and change society in a way that reflects how society is developing. We've talked about aging populations and disability. If you look at the railways, and as I say, you've heard from Sir Peter Hendy, if you were able to join that call. I mean, the challenge is that whilst it's relatively easy to bring in new, shiny, accessible bits of kit, rolling stock trains, and most of our trains now are very accessible, we still have a great deal of old infrastructure, much of it built during the reign of Queen Victoria, when, of course, the needs and requirements of disabled people were pretty much pushed aside, hidden. That was society then. We're in a different place now, but we still have that largely Victorian infrastructure. And so that infrastructure includes stations, bridges, tunnels, and the amount of space, physical space, that's available. So, of course, what we see is accessible, innovative, new bits of kit, so the rolling stock for trains, mismatched with the physical environment that they visit as they pass through. Generally not the terminus stations, which have a lot of money spent on them, but the kind of stops that people want to get off, on and off of when they're making their journey on holiday or commuting. And that mismatch is not going to change, we've estimated, until probably about 2060, with multi-billion pounds worth of investment to bring that up to a state where it becomes accessible for people to make the journeys by themselves without assistance. And of course, what we're increasingly seeing on the rail system is human beings being taken out of the equation. Human beings are expensive. They're an expensive part of running any kind of service, but particularly the railways. And technology allows driver-only trains to operate, and they're increasingly staff being taken out of stations. So if you put those two things together, it's a bit of a toxic combination for people who actually need the confidence of having people around to provide assistance, should they need it, if they do. And that's the thing that excludes people from transport. So these are kind of issues that we are trying to focus on in a way that's sensible but practical. Just a couple of key issues that I wanted to, key principles that I wanted to say need to be applied as we move into the future. Whether you're dealing with new or old, the principles that apply, I think, are relevant everywhere. One is accessibility for disabled people benefits everybody. So if you do put in ramps, if you do widen doorways, if you do have low floor buses, kneeling buses, that helps everybody. I mean, I have twins, they're 7 years old now, but when I was going around London with twins in a twin buggy, the idea of being able to cope with steps and things was a real turn-off. But actually, many of the accessibility features that have been built into our transport infrastructure benefited me. They benefit for people with luggage who are visiting, who are traveling around, and many other people. So it benefits everybody. So what we want to do is get away from the this is a cohort of people for which this is going to cost a lot of money to put in place accessibility, because it's not just for disabled people. It may take time for people to realize that they can't do what they used to do, because the ability to do so has gradually become affected by age. Something I've mentioned before, but actually, if we've got used to doing things self-reliant way, in our own time, when we want to do it, we're not going to want to stop doing that just because we are getting older, a part of that natural process. Most disabilities are non-visible. So that includes mental health, anxiety, depression, autism, sensory processing difficulties. So the idea of accessing some forms of information that are made available, whether it's audible or visible on the transport system, makes it very difficult for many people. So it's what other forms can we do that in? And the confidence to travel is absolutely vital. What we need to see is the ability of people who currently don't use, certainly public transport, to come and use public transport because they can be confident to do it. And that again is another market driver. The business case is that there are a lot of disabled people who are currently not spending their money traveling on buses or trains or even in taxis, because wheelchair accessible vehicles particularly are very few and far between. And universal design, so that my kind of last key principle will be that it's important to understand that we're not talking about separate or specialized facilities for older people or those with a disability. We're talking simply about applying good design that enables everyone to travel without stress. It's a well-established principle, universal design. It's to date failed to be recognized in many areas as the most effective and cost-effective way to address the needs of a population as a whole. So travel should not be a constant struggle to understand how ticket vending machines work. I mean, I don't have a disability myself, but I certainly struggle with some ticket vending machines just to understand which bit of the screen to touch, which button to press, which tariff do I want, which fare am I entitled to. So the core concept of intuitive design, not just physical design, but in the way they operate, is really important. And actually in the city of Barcelona, a really good example, major tourist city, so people who are there who don't speak the language, you know, that's something that disables visitors in the first place. The designers of the metro ticket machines engaged with older people, blind people, and others with disabilities to come up with a design that was intuitive to use, both by local people and by visitors. And includes a feature actually that enables you to put in your old used ticket, and you'll be issued with a new ticket to the same destination at the relevant tariff that's applicable at that time. So again, kind of very simple things that allow people to use it who would otherwise struggle. Low floor buses, and you know, a really good example of a universal design that's now applicable almost universally across Europe. What I want to do is just kind of get towards the end of this, just talk quickly about autonomy, because I know this is something that we're all kind of experiencing to a greater or lesser extent. If you have a car, if you have your own private vehicle, there will be degrees of autonomy already built into that if it's a fairly recent vehicle, whether that's the technology that keeps you in the right lane, the technology that allows your vehicle to detect other vehicles and brakes, and then accelerates when the road ahead is clear. It's pretty standard and fairly common now to find that. That's just one stage in the transition that we're on from completely driver controlled vehicles to vehicles that will be completely autonomous. It's going to be a long process and it's a fair way off, but there are some very good examples of tests going on at the moment to test full autonomy. And one that's coming up actually in Scotland is the CAV 4th autonomous bus service. I don't know whether anyone's spoken to you about this, but this is a scheduled bus service that will operate at level 4, which means that there will be a trained safety driver on board, but the driver will not be expected to touch the controls whilst the vehicle is in the autonomous mode. And this is a bus service that will do a 14-mile journey from Ferrytoll Park and Ryde in Fife, if anybody who's familiar with the area, across the Forth Road Bridge, public transport corridor to Edinburgh Park, carrying up to 10,000 passengers per week. And that will cope with a 50-mile-an-hour motorway environment, a shared environment with other vehicles, traffic lights, roundabouts. That's in development at the moment, jointly by Stagecoach, Dennis, the bus manufacturers, Napier University, Bristol Robotics Lab, and I believe the Centre for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles, part of the DFT. So again, this stuff is coming and it's being tested. The real benefit for many disabled people will be that, you know, every journey is door to door. We set off from our front door, wherever we may be, to make a journey to the final destination and then return at some point. And the first and last mile of that journey is often the most challenging bit of it. The railways may be accessible, the buses may be accessible, but getting from people's front door, many people, disabled people, happen to live in rural and certainly non-urban areas where bus services and other services are not readily available. The opportunities that autonomy brings, as well as other services like connected mobility as a service and demand responsive services, largely probably driven by autonomous vehicle technology, will really open up the opportunities for people to make that journey, that first mile journey from their front door to the train station, rather than relying on other people, and particularly as we get older and we get less able to have private vehicles that we can use ourselves. So our kind of what we're doing with the DFT at the moment is very much involved in their future of mobility work to ensure that as technology develops, there isn't a huge rush to develop things that look great and look futuristic, but actually are completely inaccessible to the very people who are most likely probably to benefit from them in terms of delivering the kind of lifestyles that people need. So in terms of where we go in the future, I think the Law Commission of the UK, which has been doing a lot of work on autonomy and the regulation of it, as well as the licensing of the technology, has been very much focused on accessibility as part of that process. So I'll just finish by saying, well, who wouldn't want the world around us to be easier to understand, to navigate, and to engage with? I would now, and I want to continue to do so as I get older and less able to do what I'm able to do now. And if you think about the way things are developed now, safety is not considered an afterthought or a nice to have. It's absolutely essential. And increasingly, decarbonisation and the environmental impacts of what we do as humans and what we develop and operate, that's no longer a nice to have, that's becoming an imperative. Certainly in transport and all equally in financial services and investments. But when it comes to ensuring that everyone can use, access, enjoy, benefit from existing and emerging transports, that's vehicles, infrastructure, and the way transport's operated, we're still in that place where it's a bit of an afterthought or a nice to have, or seen as expensive, and we'll do it if we can afford it. And so accessibility is easily overlooked. So just to go back to where we started, the idea of inclusive and co-design, use the wealth of lived experience that there is amongst disabled people and older people to design the solutions, rather than make assumptions about what people need and want with the risk of getting it wrong, because retrofitting, as we know, is always 10 times as expensive as building in accessibility from the start. And the aim to remove the barriers that create undue effort, separation, exclusion, and often additional cost for disabled people in society has got to be a key aim. It enables everyone to participate equally, confidently, and independently in everyday activities. And that all sounds great. What's not to like about it? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Keith. That was very, very enlightening and very, very interesting, and takes us another stage along the journey of the whole holistic approach of accessibility and the benefits that's a very interesting point, that the benefits that we all can derive from those, that it's a particular ramp with a barrier, a thing that you hold, a barrier to hold and stabilize oneself, and that I think we've long gone from those days where things are much more in the rounds now, and that's a wonderful sort of step forward that we've made over perhaps the last sort of 15-20 years.
I've really found what you had to say very interesting, and I think we can all see the benefits for the whole of society, like you said, with your twins in pushchairs, etc. However, in light of where we are at the moment, and thinking particularly of Putin's invasion of the Ukraine, how do we see that, or how do you yourself feel that may impact on our welfare state and the monies that go into us having a welfare state, as opposed to putting our monies into defence?
I hadn't expected to come on here and talk about Ukraine, but it's a really interesting point. And if I can,
with Carmen, always expect the unexpected.
But if I can broaden it out to look at the impacts of the pandemic as well, because I think, you know, until COVID-19 came along, there was a lot of, I mean, I've not experienced a period for a long time where the government has published so much about transport where it refers to accessibility. And that's all been in the pipeline before COVID, before Ukraine. And that costs money. And I think the important thing was that there was a real focus on how do we do that in a clever way, using the resources that we have. Now, COVID came along, and we had the William Shapps plan for rail, which is still there and still moving ahead. But that is now in the context of having to cut, you know, around £2 billion out of the transport system just on workforce reform alone. You know, what impact defence, if this escalates, then, you know, apart from all the anxiety that creates around safety and security, you know, the impact that has on the availability of money to spend on things that improve society for people in a way that we were moving, the direction we were moving before, you know, throws everything up in the air. That doesn't mean that we kind of have to accept that we stand still or even we go backwards. And one of the conversations that we've been having on the back of the William Shapps plan and the cuts in workforce reform, the cost savings, I should say, in workforce reform, are that there are lots of things you can do without necessarily having thousands of extra staff. And in fact, we know that the way that the railway system was structured historically, and this is not a surprise, has involved a lot of waste and a lot of expense, and particularly in management and behind the scenes stuff. Whereas operationally, that's where you need to focus. To deliver a service, you need to provide customer service, and to deliver customer service, you need the right kind of people. So it's not necessarily about, we use this analogy on buses. If you recruit people to drive buses, you tend to get a certain profile of person, male and female, but a certain profile of person, of somebody who really is excited about driving around a multi-ton piece of kit around the streets. What you don't tend to attract is somebody who's got customer service, empathy, and everything else. Now, you can train people who have that natural empathy and customer service approach to drive buses. It's very difficult to train people who might naturally be drawn to driving buses to be customer service people. I think that's just the nature of human beings. And you can do that on the railway system as well. The real problem is that if we do see a reduction in staff, we see a reduction in the return on huge amounts of investment that have gone into the railways over many years. Just to give you a very brief example, I know other people want to come in, but we have a lot of stations now that have heated waiting rooms, which are essential for many people, who have toilets, not just accessible toilets, but also toilets, and some assistance through mobility assistance on stations, but also lifts. Now, what happens is when you take staff out of the station completely, those things get locked up because there's a perception that they're going to be misused by people, local youth, whoever it may be, whoever you might want to blame. So they get locked up. And as you increasingly take staff off stations, and there are many, many more unstaffed stations now than there were before, that investment gets taken away. So the return on that is really wasted. So that to me seems odd. Whereas if there's a coffee shop, and the whole reform process allows this, if there's a coffee shop that's open in the environment of the railway station, even though the official train staff have gone, that person could have a key and be the person who takes the custodianship of those facilities that are available to everybody. So, I mean, you're right, I've kind of avoided answering the question, not very well, but I think you're right. You know, these are real concerns because running proper services that deliver good quality service to passengers requires money. It's about how wisely do we use the money that we're left with.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, you talked earlier and you mentioned very briefly an area which seems to me to be absolutely critical to everything you've been talking about. However innovative we are in terms of physical design, which is to do with the vehicles and with access to the vehicles and with the infrastructure that services the vehicles. And I'm talking here in terms of public service primarily. At the end of the day, unless the information design marches not only alongside, but preferably in advance, we are not going to get there. You will be older. In other words, in the deteriorating stage that I'm well advanced along, on the one hand. And on the other hand, you touched on ticket machines. Now, supposing the older person with reducing ability wants to find out which train, when, to where, how, which is user-friendly, and my ticket and the cost. And it's a nightmare at the moment. If you relate that to the bank situation where the reducing number of ATMs and banks available, how, in where you sit in the government area, how can the government, Parliament, help industry to achieve user-friendly information design in public transport service?
Yeah. And, I think that the short answer is that there are examples of good practice, really good practice around the world. And I think the tendency of our government is to kind of look at, almost like reinvent the wheel, or look at what we can do here without going broader, or actually without even looking broadly within this country for good examples. They may not be in transport, they may be in other parts of our society. So I would say what government needs to do, and it's something that we encourage them to do all the time, is not take a blinkered approach to looking at more of the same old stuff with a few tweaks to it. It's about how do you reinvent something for a society that has quite substantially changed. And don't make assumptions. Don't make assumptions that everyone has access to a smartphone, or everyone can actually use a smartphone in the way that I have older children, not just the 7-year-old twins, that my kind of 21-year-old can use. These digital natives have grown up without instruction booklets, but seem to be able to use all this stuff to the best of its ability. But most of us can't. And I think that's always going to be the case. So I think the really crucial thing is to give people choices and not just to go down one single route. So if you have a society where people's reliance, and take your cash points, your ATM example, we have a society where we have a lot of people who still rely on cash, access to cash, who don't have a smartphone that they can just use Apple Pay and pay for everything. That the importance of having that access to cash within an easily achievable distance from where most people tend to live is really important. Yet we're seeing a reduction in that, and an assumption that people can access cash or transfer cash around in other ways. That doesn't give people those options. And if there's a cost attached to giving people the options that they need, because we still have a society where people can't all homogeneously just do everything in the same way, then we have to build that cost in. And I think it's very easy, and coming back to the earlier point about the impact on available funds to actually deliver access in terms of transport. If it's the cost of doing business and the cost of delivering services to everybody equitably and inclusively is more than the cost of doing it through one particular route, then you have to factor that in, and everybody has to pay that cost. You don't try and deliver the cheapest way of delivering services that then excludes people. So I think it's a real challenge, Clive, and I don't think it's one that this government or any previous governments in this country have ever really managed to get their heads around, because the pressures from industry in terms of driving down costs and not seeing additional regulation, we've seen the kind of red tape challenge where regulations have been removed. Brexit has again been seen part of that, where we've seen regulations watered down or removed because it's expensive for various parts of industry. It's kind of natural, but actually there comes a point at which you need to say you have to make your services accessible to everybody, and if there's a cost to that, so be it. And I'll just give one very brief example that arose out of COVID. And that was, the ability of people to get access to talk to their bank or their mortgage provider. That became very difficult because banks went completely online and you can't get everything you need online. And their call centers shut down because it was cheaper for them to do that. Operationally, they could still offer it because they could offer it from home. It doesn't matter where people sit when they answer a call center. You have no idea whether they're at home in their pajamas or sitting in the Bahamas. But some banks and financial services providers automatically cut out that part of it, put everything online and said, just do this, because they needed to cut the cost. And our response on my work with the Financial Conduct Authority was, don't do that, because you are preventing people from accessing the services that you've promised them and they're entitled to access just by doing that. So again, I think it's a kind of long-winded answer to say it ain't easy. But there are opportunities to actually keep things on the cards for people to access everything that they need. But that choice is really important. I think we all like choice, not too much choice, but we all like enough choice to decide whether we use route A, route B, route C to access the services that we want. And I think to maintain that is really important. And yes, there is a cost attached to that, but that's spread across everybody who's buying that service.
In my working life, I've done a fair bit of work with mobility, handicapped people and disabled people, but first at the Chartered Institution for Highways and Transportation, and then more latterly at the Transport Research Laboratory. But at the same time, I'm a cyclist, and I know that one of the big conflicts is between elderly people and disabled people and cyclists. How do you think those sorts of conflicts can be reduced or removed?
Thanks. None of these are easy questions, are they? But they're all the important questions, and I wish I had the answers to it. I mean, you're right, because the kind of built environment is shared space. I'll just mention shared space, which is some of you will know is the concept of people being confident to walk around an area where they're sharing that space in a level environment with trucks and cars and cyclists and everybody else. It's kind of withered on the vine to the extent that they were never designed properly or well thought through. But the ideas, the challenges and conflicts that they presented are the kind of ones that you're talking about, Derek. And that is, and I'm a cyclist. I don't own a car. I have a bike. I live in London. What's the point of having a car? Transport's fantastic. But there is I don't share it myself, but I know lots of people who would use bikes more if they had the confidence to move around. And the confidence comes from the fact there's so much traffic. I know people who lack confidence on some of those environments because of cyclists. Cyclists, not just on the pavement, but also cyclists coming around bus stops and they're crossing the road to get to the bus stop. And there are lots of design ideas that crop up, people think are fantastic, which actually, had they been co-designed, inclusively designed, properly thought through, using people with lived experience, they might have been designed better. And the idea of bus stop islands is one of those, where the cycle lane will be going along and then there's a bus stop ahead of you, and the cycle lane goes between the bus stop and the pavement, away from the traffic, and then comes back out into the cycle lane on the road again. Now, for many people, certainly who are visually impaired or hearing impaired, who kind of struggle with kind of picking up the signals that probably most of us pick up very easily in those environments, crossing that cycle lane to the bus stop from the pavement is equivalent to crossing a road or a motorway, particularly when many cyclists in urban areas are lycra-clad Olympic-style cyclists who approach this as a sport, not as just a means of getting from A to B. And the kind of cycle superhighway concept kind of, I think, encouraged that. So
I must declare an interest because I led the research into bus stop islands when I was at the TRL. And we did actually involve quite a lot of people with disabilities, both wheelchair users, blind, visually impaired, hearing impaired people, as well as people with other sort of mental problems as well, on different designs of the layouts.
Yeah. And it's
but I do recognise that it is an issue. Yes.
It is an issue, and I think it's one of those things that's taken on a life of its own, where there are now so many established examples of this that it then just becomes part of we'll do that there because we want to try and avoid cyclists being in the very busy part of the roadway. And I suppose my argument would be, who do you think is where are the risks coming from, and how do you mitigate those risks that you're presenting either to the pedestrian moving from the pavement across to the bus stop, or people getting off a bus stop and in a large number and kind of moving across an environment where it's not clear where you are, whether you're sharing that space with other vehicles, etc. Or is it to the cyclist who can manage that, or you can mitigate the risks to them a bit differently? And I think that's where we're lacking some of that real thought about how do you mitigate those. There are risks to everything, but how do you mitigate them? And just, e-scooters have been, I did mention them earlier, and they're a bit of a bugbear, but they're, apart from the trial e-scooters in certain areas, e-scooters on public land are illegal. You can't use them, but they are everywhere, and largely used on the pavement, and largely at great speed, and often by people who don't have any care for their own safety because they're not wearing helmets. And on my school run, taking their kids to school on the front of the e-scooter. Now, how do you, managing people's own stupidity is a very difficult thing to do. And, having enforcement processes in place is, it's unmanageable for that kind of thing. But the risks that they pose to pedestrians, particularly pedestrians who can't pick up those signals and don't expect to be sharing their pavement space with motorized vehicles, is huge. And we've seen, sadly, too many incidents. So yes, the kind of, and COVID again, just led to some very rapid policy decisions about using the available space on pavements to allow, for example, restaurants, cafes and shops to use the pavement space so that people could be socially distanced. And some of those things cropped up overnight, and the impact that had on people who are used to wayfinding by themselves, they're visually impaired, wayfinding along that pavement. Overnight, suddenly there were challenges and hurdles that didn't exist before. And encouraging people to go into the road where there was a kind of space set aside for people, pedestrians, to use the roadway, wasn't thought through, because for people who need dropped curbs to get off the pavement into the roads, normally to cross it, but in this case to use that bit of road that had been set aside for pedestrians, they weren't available because that wasn't where you were designed to go down into the road. You needed a dropped curb. So it's a minefield. It's a bit of a nightmare, but I think we've learned so many lessons over the last 2 years that hopefully we can begin to either rectify some of the problems and not make the same mistakes again.
My background is vehicle leasing and asset management, so I look at things from a slightly different perspective. And one of the things I've noticed, and I'm most exposed to, I suppose, PSVR and coaches, is not necessarily broader society's will to bring things in, which I think everybody agrees universally is a very good thing. One of the difficulties that a lot of businesses face is actually financing the changes and modifications that they need to make in order to adopt the latest requirements. And I suppose my question is, do you think the government, or certainly the banks that are backed by the government, like the British Business Bank and the Green Investment Bank, whatever, could maybe be targeted with making it a little bit easier to adopt some of the things that you'd like to see? Because I know, for example, in the coaching industry, it was £25,000 to modify a coach for PSVR, but they couldn't raise finance against that. So if you had 10 coaches, you had to find £250,000 of free cash to change your fleet. And it would have been really good if there was somewhere they could go to get bank support on that, rather than having to find it from their cash flows. So I just wonder what you thought about government involvement in those sort of things, and whether it would make your job easier.
Yeah, I think it would, and it could actually speed up the process, because things have a long life. Trains have a long life, coaches, buses, and they have different lives throughout that lifespan. So, what may be a coach on a scheduled service might end up being a coach on a leisure on a leisure service, where actually the rules are different and the regulations don't apply in the same way. And because of that lifespan, inevitably, when new regulations are brought in, there is an opportunity to kind of reflect that in reality. So, for example, there might be a 15-year period at the end of which all rolling stock or all coaches will have to meet these requirements, in the hope that that will minimize the huge investment that would otherwise be required to suddenly, or over a shorter period, bring everything up to speed. And that's the issue. So I think to certainly to speed things up and to encourage the industry to do that, and particularly post-COVID, where the kind of coach industry has been devastated by just the lack of people's ability to travel, and therefore no bookings, no income. That would be, I think, hugely beneficial. I mean, there will be. I mean, the government's announced the review of PSVAR, and there will be exemptions built into that. There will be a time period built into that to try and minimize the kind of financial cost. But I'm sure the industry will never be happy with that. And why would they be? Because ideally, you wouldn't want to have to spend money that you hadn't planned on spending in the next 5 years, if you can avoid it. But I think there is that kind of brings me back to why it's important that we do take a medium to longer term view of what the future should look like. And we're doing that in rail, and doing that in coach. And that is because the population and the aging population and the needs to be accessible means you're going to be reducing your potential business if you don't make those changes. So there's a business case for doing that. But the other thing is that, why would any of us as individuals expect the bus that we get to work or to the shops to be accessible, because there have been regulations in place that require that for some time now. The train to be accessible, but actually when we decide to take a coach leisure trip somewhere, it doesn't have to be accessible in the same way. And in fact, perversely what you see is that many coaches that have been operating on scheduled services where the regulations apply to be accessible are then taken into the leisure market, and many of those accessibility features are removed because they take up space. So whether it's a lift or whatever it might be, they're removed, and therefore you're actually taking away something that could have actually been accessible and allowed more people to use that coach service, albeit you might reduce the number of seats that you can have in that coach. So it's a real balancing act between the costs of doing this, the time period that you allow for these changes to be brought in, and the financial support that you provide an industry to make those changes and to do that in a way that doesn't put them out of business. And I think nobody wants to see businesses go bust because of new requirements and regulations coming in. So that time frame is really, really important. And as DIPTAC, we're not a group of sort of shouty consumery lobbying people. We're actually trying to be very realistic. So while there are lots of groups of disabled people's organizations out there who say you've got to do this and you've got to do it now, and it doesn't matter what it costs, you have to do it. Our approach is very much more measured, in that we like the model that's happened with rail, with buses, and we want to apply that to other areas, so that at least there's a route map that by 2030, 2035, whatever it might be, that mode of transport will be accessible in this way.
I've got to say, Keith, I wouldn't necessarily defend the coach industry, because it kind of sneaks up, and they only had 20 years notice that this was coming. Yes. So in reality, I mean, there's a little bit there. I think that the reality is, the point I was making is, rather than quite often you see things that come from government that are grant funded, because I think that suits budget. And in reality, if they were slightly more creative with the way they use their money, they might actually be able to deliver an awful lot more, because what they do is make more of what you want accessible to more people. Because it would be funded. And I'm not just thinking about coaches, although I'm exposed to that. We recently we had a building that was built in the 1980s, and we've just changed that building and made it completely accessible. Previously, it was only accessible to the regulations in the 80s, and we spent a good amount of money on it. Now, we're fortunate in the position that we can take that from our cash flows, but I know a lot of businesses that would have found every excuse in the book to get away with cutting corners and doing the minimum possible, because it would have been a fair chunk out of their their liquid resources. So yeah, it was just the point of, if the government could think about how they fund things rather than how they just grant fund things, then that might be you might find everything gets delivered far quicker.
Yeah, that's a really good takeaway. I'll take that away. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I found this very interesting, and I very much appreciate your pragmatic approach. My question at the moment is, it's the balancing of the different groups in society and the different concerns, for example, for safety and mobility and accessibility. And I have a couple of examples. One is in that I put in the chat. Some people are really good at designing steps which have a pathway for wheelchairs. If you are not if your vision is not very good, those steps can be absolutely lethal. I've experienced this. We recently had to reinstall in the flats in my parents' building fire safety closers. Result, I have a great difficulty of opening the front door now. My parents would not have been able to get into or out of their flat. How on earth can we get the balance right between the different categories that we're trying to protect, both the different disabilities among people, and does safety trump access? They're really complicated, I think. And actually, your example about the inner cycle lanes is a very good one of that. You know, you protect the cyclists and make it absolutely lethal for the pedestrian. Back to you.
Thank you. No, and it is a constant balancing act that needs to be done. I mean, there are, and that's why I kind of alluded to it in my talk, in that there is often far too much focus on the physical accessibility of transport or buildings, when in fact, in terms of disabilities per se, far more disabilities are not physical. I mean, they are non-visible disabilities, and that includes sight loss and hearing loss, as well as many other things, that kind of neurodiversity issues and autism and dementia, and I mean, you name it. You know, there are people out there who are far more likely to be excluded because their needs and requirements have not been factored in. Whereas if you're in a wheelchair, then that tends to be the thing that most people think about in terms of ramps and you know, automatic doors. So yes, it is constant. There are some pretty well established technological requirements and specifications that aim to deal with a lot of those issues. So, for example, the amount of pressure that you need to apply to a button in order to operate a door or whatever it might be. And I think there is always going to be a risk that by designing something to include or to provide access for one group of people, you are inevitably going to not necessarily exclude by doing that, but not make it as easy for other people. And I think that's something that always has to be factored in. And you know, when we talk to industry and talk about kind of co-design and inclusive design and, you know, working with people who have lived experience, we're not there yet where we can get that true diversity of disability experience. And other, I mean, the kind of intersectional issues apply everywhere. And it kind of, you know, and I talked about kind of the confidence to travel, and that applies just as much to disabled people, or people who might, they don't necessarily need assistance, but they might need assistance on their journey. And if they do, they don't have the confidence that someone's going to be around to deliver it. The same kind of anxiety applies to women who might be traveling alone late at night. You know, the kind of, because the perception is that there is a risk attached to doing that, and you don't want to take that risk, so you don't make the journey, so you're excluded. And I think there are just so many of these kind of intersectional issues that apply here. And within disability, there are so many, sometimes conflicting, competing interests that need to be thought through. And I suppose the ultimate is, can you deliver something that is better than what we have now for everybody, that may not be the best for everybody, but is the best for most people? And that example of I gave of shared space, I think is that issue writ large, because the idea of local authorities designing areas around shop, I mean, mostly kind of areas where people will come to shop and sit and share, but you don't want to stop traffic coming through. And there are examples, I mean, in London, a kind of Exhibition Road, which apparently is not officially a shared space, but you know, you don't know where the pavement ends and the road begins. And that's a kind of example. And you know, there are certain groups representing disabled people who hate that, and others, because of the level space, love it. So wheelchair users and others don't have to cope with curbs, don't have to go hundreds of meters up the road to get to the crossing where they can cross level, whereas people who have visual impairments and groups representing them think it's a nightmare, because how do you make sure that you can navigate that space safely while sharing it with, you know, a few tons of metal being driven by people who don't really give a damn and don't understand what your needs are as a pedestrian. So, you know, that we're constantly struggling with, how do you design something that's going to be great for those people without making it worse or creating risks for others? And you're right, you know, I think it's going to keep me in job for quite some time to come.
I'm afraid it is, because I actually don't think, in some areas, it may be possible to design things so that they work for a larger proportion of the population. But that may actually exclude some other people even more than they are at the moment. So the trade-offs are extremely difficult. But thank you.
But Keith, that has been extremely good, and lots of very much food for thought for us all. And on behalf of us all here this afternoon, thank you, Clive, for organising and setting all this up. Thank you, Richard, for orchestrating the technical side behind the scenes there. And thank you very much for everyone attending. And we'll see you on the first Tuesday. And to you, Keith, thank you very much once again. And we'll see you on the first Tuesday next month. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.